Hello everyone, and welcome to this broadcast, which is brought to you by the Open Forum. Imagine living in a country where you are under constant surveillance, your religion, your language, and your way of life is under systematic attack. And if you speak out against these injustices, or even send a message privately to a friend, it could land you in prison. You might have heard of this place, Tibet, a country whose people have endured decades of occupation following the invasion by China in 1950. But when did you last hear about news from there? In addition to being one of the most repressive places in the world, occupied Tibet is also one of the most closed. Information and even people do not escape easily. And yet Tibet is inextricably tied to some of the most pressing concerns in the world today, whether it is the importance of Tibet's environment or the connection between the repression of Tibetans and the Uyghur people, who we've heard about in previous Open Forum broadcasts. They will explore Tibet, the repression and the resistance. I'm John Jones from Free Tibet, a London-based organisation that supports the Tibetan struggle for freedom. And I will today be talking to a panel of experts, Dr. Tsering Topgyal, a political scientist and lecturer at the University of Birmingham, Lhadon Tethong. Lhadon is the co-founder and director of the Tibet Action Institute, and Tim Loughton, a member of Parliament and chair of the all-party parliamentary group for Tibet here in the UK. Before we go to our first speaker, we're going to show a brief video which the panel agrees encapsulates the different kinds of repression that Tibetans face, and also how difficult it is for Tibetans and the stories that they have to tell to escape. This footage was recorded at Patala Palace in the Himalayas in September 2006, almost 15 years ago. And I will warn viewers in advance that some of this footage is disturbing.
They're shooting them like dogs. Yeah.
Eight o'clock, one freezing morning at the Nepalese border. At 5,700 meters altitude, it seems the time is always frozen. Dozens of Tibetans are walking in line silently through the mountains of snow, trying to reach India and see the Dalai Lama, their spiritual leader. The deep silence of the camp, where Romanian and foreign climbers gathered, is killed by a machine gun. Everybody can see a Chinese soldier standing in the shooting position. He opens fire. The bullets hit human flesh. Tibetans fall to the ground. One of them seems to escape the bullets but is hit by a second round. He dies in the snow. As if nothing happened, the group of pilgrims walks away and never looks back. The ProTV cameraman gets the incredible scenes on tape. He is 1 kilometer away from the Tibetans when he watches another victim falling down. The Danish and the British climbers are simply overwhelmed by what they see.
It's very strange for me to see all this thing happens. To see this thing happen so close. I'm not used to it. I don't know what right the Chinese think they have to do things like this. There's no need to kill.
Hours pass by. A stranger arrives in the camp. He's one of the hunted Tibetans. He hides in the toilet.
You wanted to go to Dalai Lama?
There's a Tibetan in the toilet behind me, hiding from the Chinese military. Another Tibetan man was shot and left to die in the snow over 5 hours ago. I saw the soldiers firing. Sergio makes a risky move. He helps the Tibetan with some clothes and food. I gave him some of my clothes. I also shared with him some food I had. In the distance, 3 Chinese soldiers count their victims. Undisturbed, they leave one body in the snow. Trying to find new information, the Chinese soldiers enter the climbers' camp. They have more than 20 prisoners, 7 of them are children. For them, the pilgrimage to the Dalai Lama will end in a jail cell. The Chinese soldiers are smoking, relaxed. For them, it's just another successful mission. In spite of what all the climbers witnessed, the Chinese news agency, Xinhua, announces that Chinese frontier soldiers tried to persuade the group of Tibetans to go home, but the Tibetans refused and attacked the soldiers. These were then forced to defend themselves and to wound 2 persons. This is just another episode from an endless story. It started 47 years ago when the Dalai Lama was forced by the Chinese troops to flee in Dharamshala. Now the Dalai Lama heads the Tibetan government in exile from India. Just to see him or touch him, many Tibetans pay with their lives. Meanwhile, year after year, they are forced to watch their beloved religious temples turned into rubble.
Almost 15 years ago that took place. In that video, we saw Chinese border guards firing upon Tibetans who were attempting to cross the Himalayas. Many tried to escape their own country. Did we get to this situation? We're going to start by hearing from Dr. Tsering Topgyal, a political scientist and lecturer at the University of Birmingham. He's going to give us some vital background on where Tibet is and about its history.
Okay, can I check if you can hear me, John? Thank you. Yeah, thank you so much, and John, for organizing this event and for inviting me. It is a pleasure for me to share the stage with Mr. Tim Loughton and Lhadon. So I was given 10 minutes to set the context, speak in terms of why there is a conflict over Tibet, and also some historical overview. So what I will do is very quickly make a case that what we see in Tibet is a colonial encounter between a colonial, increasingly more powerful colonial power and an anti-colonial resistance, to that occupation. And then I will go on to, give a bit of historical backdrop. When did this encounter start, and what were the changes that it went through, and then go on to talk about the nature of Chinese rule or Chinese colonialism in Tibet, by drawing upon the writings of two Tibetan writers and intellectuals who live in Tibet and China. And then, depending on how much time we have, I will quickly give an overview of where we are in terms of the debates among Chinese intellectuals with regards to policies towards people like the Tibetans in China, and also the Chinese policies, and how these debates and the policy shifts that we have observed in the last few years relate to each other. So to talk about, to make the case that, we are seeing a colonial encounter, if we stop intellectualizing the relationship between the Chinese and the Tibetans too much, and remove some of the conceptual clutter that we observe in the literature on Chinese relations, and remove some of the false equivalences in the literature and the discourse on the relationship between the Chinese and the Tibetans, we observe what we are left with in terms of the naked sort of corporeal fact is a colonial encounter. Now, it is quite controversial to use this word, and some people might reject the utility of the term colonialism when it applies to China. But it is increasingly being used in the academic language as well. So without giving you too much of the detail, when I say colonialism, it's not just the classic colonialism of exploiting, dominating another group of people and exploiting the resources and the people there, but also in the sense of a settler colonialism that is being observed in Tibet. So how did this all start, right? So the Chinese and the Tibetans have a very long relationship going back to the, at least the 6th century and the 7th century, when, and between the 7th and 9th centuries, the Tibetan Empire and the Tang Empire were peer competitors in the region. And then there is a history of Tibet coming under the rule of the Mongol Empire and the Ching empires. So although Tibet has a history of being dominated and being influenced by these powers, some of them based in China, we don't have a history where Tibet was part of a Chinese state, and particularly a Han Chinese state. It is only in the modern period when Eastern Tibet was annexed into the Manchu Empire, and then later nominally ruled by the nationalist government, and then particularly after the PRC annexed all of Tibet, that we have in the first time in history a Han Chinese state ruling over Tibetan affairs. So, but how did this colonial encounter start? We can go back to the period after 1904, when the last Chinese empire, the Manchu Empire, was in its death throes, and when the British invaded Tibet, that the Ching dynasty, which was increasingly under Han Chinese sort of officials, started to copy the colonial rule or practices of Japan and also Western countries in the Eastern Tibetan regions, and then with the ultimate goal of applying those policies in the whole of Tibet, if they were able to manage that. Obviously, the Qing Manchu Empire collapsed in 1911-12, and it didn't come to that. But with the PRC being established in 1949 and annexing all of Tibet, that's when we see a full-blown colonial enterprise in Tibet. Obviously, there's a lot of historical sort of detail that we need to go into, but we don't have the time, right? So obviously, there were periods when the Chinese rule was harsher, and then periods when policies were more relaxed. And then there were also periods when dialogue with the Dalai Lama and the exiles happened, in at least two, different periods. And then there were periods when the dialogue process collapsed without producing any results. And we are sort of going through one of those periods after 2010, when dialogue and talks have more or less ended. So to move very quickly into the nature of Chinese colonialism, as I said, I'm going to rely on the work of the Tibetan writer Weser, who writes in Chinese, who lives in Beijing, in China, and writing of Shokdung, another Tibetan writer who lives in Eastern Tibet, in Qinghai province. So what do they say in terms of the nature of Chinese rule, right? So Shokdung wrote a book after the 2008 Tibetan protests, which is rendered in English as The Division of Heaven and Earth on Tibet's Peaceful Revolution, referring to the 2008 uprising in the Tibetan Plateau. So in his description of Chinese rule over Tibet, he characterizes Chinese rule over Tibet as a totalitarian rule, and that Tibet in the PRC period has been a slaughterhouse, and particularly in reference to the Chinese quelling of the 2008 uprising, he refers to Tibet as a 21st century slaughterhouse, right? And he refers to Tibet as a hellish prison, and also a place where Tibetans who were loyal to Tibetan identity, Tibetan interests, Tibetans who were smart, intelligent, were such as the Panchen Lama and many others, have been punished by sending to these prisons. And in his reference to how the protests throughout the period after 1949 in Tibet have been suppressed, he refers to Tibet as a terrifying battlefield where militarization of and securitization of life in all its senses is an everyday reality, right? So that's how he describes Chinese rule. And then in his description of the his characterization of the Tibetan protest in 2008, he refers to it as driven by political coercion and suppression, economic pillage and extortion, and cultural domination, right? And he talks about the Tibetan protests as a fight for freedom and democracy. And he actually says that the 2008 protests was the beginning of the Tibetan consciousness of statehood, Tibetan statehood, Tibetan sovereignty, Tibetan political and territorial and national consciousness, right? So if we go to Versir, who wrote about the Tibetan self-immolations, what drove the Tibetans to protest in 2008 and self-immolate, right? So it's he characterizes the Chinese suppression of Tibetan religious belief, destruction of Tibetan environment, loss of Tibetan language, and imposition of Mandarin Chinese, Chinese immigration to Tibetan areas, and an increasing control and surveillance of Tibetan life by the Chinese, and also the failure of dialogue with the Dalai Lama, right? So from these, it's not an exile or a non-Tibetan from outside making these things up. These are written by Tibetans who were born in Tibet and grew up under the Chinese Communist Party, who wrote these things. So where are we in terms of Chinese debates on the minority affairs and particularly policies in Tibet? In response to the Tibetan uprising in 2008, the incidents in Xinjiang in 2009 and afterward, and also disturbances in Inner Mongolia in 2011 and after that, Chinese scholars, prominent Chinese scholars like Hu Angang, Liu Lianhe, and Hu Lianhe and Ma Rong wrote about proposed getting rid of all these rights and status and autonomy sort of provisions for all ethnic minorities, and essentially practice a much more assimilationist, integrationist set of policies, so that ethnic consciousness is removed and Chineseness among the ethnic minorities will improve, right? And there was a lot of debate, within China and also involving some ethnic minorities. But the question was, to what extent the Chinese government would take up these, and the Communist Party would take up these policies. But in the Xi Jinping period, we have observed most of these policies or reforms advocated by these scholars implemented in Tibet, in Xinjiang, elimination or reduction of Tibetan language education and imposition of Mandarin Chinese, and the incentivization of inter-ethnic marriage, mostly marriage between Tibetans and Chinese, increasing surveillance and securitization of life. All of these have been implemented, although the institutions from the 1949 post-1949 period still remains the autonomy law and the constitutional provisions. All of these remain, but in actual implementation, life in Tibet has become much more assimilationist and controlled, as it is in Xinjiang. So I will end here, and maybe my colleagues will flesh some of these things out, and in the Q&A we will also have opportunity to flesh some of these things out.
Thank you, Tsering, for that history of Tibet. Before we pass to our next speaker, Lhadon, we are just going to share a snapshot of life in Lhasa, the capital of Tibet. This is from 2016, it's one of the last times that the Chinese government allowed foreign journalists in, albeit on a closely supervised tour. And you're going to see a little bit about how China tries to present life in Tibet. And then after the video, we're going to hear the reality movement. They're experts in digital and non-violent direct action. And Lhadon's going to bring us up to date with what Tibet is like today.
Sounds of spirituality punctuating the pre-dawn quiet in Lhasa, the Tibetan capital. This is the Jokang Temple, one of Tibetan Buddhism's holiest places. But the peaceful setting belies the region's tumultuous history. The communist government in Beijing has controlled Tibet since 1951. After a failed revolt against Chinese rule in 1959, the 14th Dalai Lama, Tibet's spiritual leader, fled abroad. Simmering defiance from Tibetans who remain sometimes boils over into large-scale riots. Activists say hundreds have lit themselves on fire in protest of religious and cultural suppression. This is the Tibet the Chinese government does not want us to see. In early September, CNN was given rare access to the Tibetan Autonomous Region, one of the most restricted places in China. We were allowed in only under the watchful eye of government minders, who organized our days from morning till night. We saw art classes, an opera, new hotels, and an international tourism expo populated almost exclusively by locals. But for people who track daily life in Lhasa, they say the calm exterior masks tensions that still lie beneath the surface.
Tibet is one of the regions in China where the political suppression and religious suppression are at the highest point.
The Chinese government has invested billions of dollars into transforming Tibet. They say the standard of living has risen dramatically. There is new infrastructure, new schools, but also massive migration of Han Chinese, the dominant ethnicity in China. For all the development in and around Lhasa, though, there's still a lot of poverty. Neighborhoods with homes like these, built of nothing but cinder blocks, no insulation, patched roofs, and many of these neighborhoods are populated by Tibetans, many of whom say they feel like second-class citizens in their own homeland. This is the only ordinary Tibetan we managed to speak with independently after leaving our minders behind during a lunch break. He didn't go to school and works as a laborer. When we are doing the exact same work, the Han people get, say, 300 kwai, and the Tibetans get 200 kwai. He says the Hans get paid more than we do. He's frustrated, but says there's not much he can do. If he protested, activists say he could be questioned and jailed without a second thought.
The lack of space for any kind of dissent, even peaceful, will continue to drive deep resentment in Tibetan society.
Many of those recently detained have been protesting over the lack of religious freedom and economic equality, and in support of the exiled Dalai Lama, who has been advocating greater autonomy for Tibet. We went to the Patala Palace, where he used to live. But during an hour-long tour inside, he was scarcely mentioned. Just at the end of the tour, we asked our tour guide one question about him, and our government minders immediately said it was time to move on to the next activity. The lack of access to anything controversial or the ability to ask any real questions was a theme of this trip. We'd hoped to ask this Chinese official, the region's vice chairman, some difficult questions. Instead, we were forced to sit silently as he spoke for 80 uninterrupted minutes, talking about how everyone in Tibet is happy and content, a picture in stark contrast to the one painted by human rights activists. The Chinese government will tell you the peace of early morning prayers at the Jokang Temple is emblematic of broader Tibet. Others will tell you that demonstrations of dissent are just a spark away from being reignited.
Thanks very much, John. It is, an honor and a pleasure to be with my co-panelists today, especially Tsering, who I have not seen in a long time. I want to thank the Open Forum for hosting us in this important discussion. And I want to just warn you, it's definitely pandemic living. I have some little ones running around my house, and I do hope none will decide to make a guest appearance on the show today. But I warn you, in case that happens, hopefully it won't. So yeah, let me begin. In February, I guess it was, Freedom House released its annual Freedom in the World report, one of the most widely respected and frequently cited rankings on the state of civil and political liberties in the world. The report ranked Tibet as the #1 least free place on earth, tied with Syria. This news is likely to surprise many people because Tibet is not often in the headlines these days, certainly not in the same way it used to be. Even many people interested in and concerned about the Sino-Tibetan conflict, like government officials, human rights advocates, and journalists, are now unclear about what exactly is going on there. But this is no accident. It is by design. In recent years, China has so effectively locked Tibet down that it has become a black hole for information. The vast majority of Tibetans can't get out, the international community can't get in, and sending out information by phone or on a messaging app like WeChat can lead to detention, torture, and years in prison. So serious are Chinese authorities about keeping the lid on Tibet shut tightly that we recently saw a case where a young monk was given a longer sentence for sending out news about a political protest in Tibet than the sentences that were given to the monks who actually engaged in the protest itself. Even the thousands of Tibetans who once escaped each year on foot over the Himalayan mountains into Nepal and then India, like we saw in the video at the beginning of the show, have now been blocked from coming. Increased Chinese patrols, even on the highest windswept passes, and the use of high-tech surveillance methods, including drones and facial recognition technology, have turned the flow of escapees into barely a trickle. Where an average of 2,200 Tibetans escaped per year up until 2008, now only a handful successfully make it out. In 2019, only 18 are recorded as having done so. This most recent clampdown started after the March 2008 uprising in Tibet, when waves of protests swept across all of historical Tibet and challenged the Chinese government at the moment it mattered most, in the lead up to the 2008 Olympic Games in Beijing, which China saw as its global coming out party, and thus the Chinese authorities were determined there would be no sign of instability or dissent. At that moment, we saw a new generation of Tibetans, raised entirely within the Chinese system, with no memory of an independent Tibet, risk everything to come into the streets and to demand their freedom and an end to Chinese rule, and to call for the return of the Dalai Lama. They appeared to be fearless, and it rattled Chinese leaders and the nation to its core. This was one of the most open displays of defiance in years, and it was playing out in the new age of the internet, with video and images coming out of even the remotest corners of Tibet in real time. The on-the-ground security response to the March 2008 uprising was breathtaking in scale and scope. Thousands of Tibetans were disappeared, detained, tortured, and imprisoned, and military and paramilitary forces flooded the Tibetan plateau. Yet even in that terrifying environment, where a climate of fear persisted everywhere in Tibet, the Tibetan people continued to resist. And in what is perhaps one of the most astounding and upsetting campaigns of protest in modern human history, many Tibetans did the only thing they felt was possible to convey the depths of their suffering, and at the same time their defiance, at a time when China seemed to have total control over their lives. They lit their own bodies on fire to protest the occupation. Since 2009, at least 157 Tibetans have self-immolated to protest China's repression, and to again, like the protests of 2008, call for freedom, independence, unity between Tibetans, and the return of the Dalai Lama. These people came from every walk of life. They were nomads, students, farmers, teachers, monks, nuns, mothers, fathers, and even children. 125 of the 157 self-immolators are known to have died following their protest. 26 of them were 18 years or younger. The last person to self-immolate that we know of was a 24-year-old man named Yunten on November 26, 2019. It was just before the self-immolation protest took off in 2011 that Chen Quanguo, the party secretary for the Tibetan Autonomous Region, came to power in Tibet and took the repression already existing there to a whole new level. As John mentioned in his introduction, he then moved on to East Turkestan in 2016. And the system of surveillance and repression it took him 5 years to roll out in Tibet, now tried and tested, took only 2 there, and has escalated so dramatically that the world is now finally recognizing the atrocities being carried out under his watch as genocide against the Uyghur people. And sadly, as all of us on this panel can attest to, in Tibet today, China's repression continues unabated, and the Chinese government's assault on Tibetans as a distinct people has reached a breaking point. Chinese President Xi Jinping is pushing cultural nationalist policies that seek to force the so-called ethnic minorities in the People's Republic of China, Tibetans and Uyghurs chief among them, to assimilate so as to quash any and all resistance to the state. But this is not just about preventing protests. It's about transforming the people themselves in both behavior and thought. In order to wipe out Tibetan resistance, once and for all, Chinese authorities are targeting the 3 foundational pillars of Tibetan identity: religion, language, and the nomadic way of life. They are targeted for elimination. This elimination project is being carried out in every space: in the monasteries, in the workplace, in primary and nursery schools, on the grasslands, in towns, neighborhoods, and private homes. Over the past 20 years, Chinese authorities have forced millions of Tibetans to leave their traditional homes, including approximately 1 million nomads from the grasslands, putting many into reservation-style housing projects with little access to jobs or services, and so no future for the young people. And the monasteries and nunneries and centers of Tibetan Buddhist learning are slowly being strangled with rules and regulations that push monks and nuns out, block new and younger ones from joining. And for those that remain, there is little time for religious studies and Buddhist practice because they're forced to spend endless hours studying up on the latest propaganda from Beijing. The current Chinese Communist Party secretary in the Tibetan Autonomous Region, Wu Yinjie, has stated that the Dalai Lama must be removed from religion. His stated objective, as of a recent high-level meeting on Tibet, is to break lineages, break connections, and break origins. Anyone who knows Tibetan Buddhism knows this means its destruction. And perhaps one of the most disturbing and alarming abuses happening in Tibet today, as part of this final assault on Tibetanness, is the attack on Tibetan's mother tongue by changing the medium of instruction in all Tibetan schools from Tibetan to Chinese and using the false guise of a push for bilingual education. This has meant a new push removing primary and middle school aged Tibetan children from their home communities by coercing parents to send them away to boarding schools, or what we at Tibet Action Institute are now calling residential schools. One Tibetan researcher has estimated that 80% of all Tibetan children in historical areas of Tibet are now in a residential school. This would mean over 900,000 Tibetan children who have essentially been put in residential schools where they're forced to speak and study in Chinese. They face political indoctrination and even physical and sexual abuse. Now, even more disturbingly, we're hearing reports of the very, very young Tibetan children, as young as 3 years old, being taken away from their parents by the state and put in these residential schools. As the mother of a 4-year-old, I cannot bear to think of being forced to part with my child at such a young age. This is the anguish that Tibetan parents are being put through at the hands of this ruthless regime. And as we all know, residential schools have long been used as a colonial tool to assimilate children. And these practices are now widely discredited and actually looked upon as abhorrent. It was residential schools which caused generations of Indigenous people and First Nations in Canada and Australia to face unbelievable harm, trauma, and suffering that continues to this day. And at this point, it's clear that the Chinese government doesn't care. It's hell-bent on eliminating Tibetan identity because just by being Tibetan, The very existence of this distinct cultural, religious, and linguistic identity is a threat to the state. Tibetans are different. As they have demonstrated time after time, Tibetan loyalty does not lie with the Chinese Communist Party or even with China. But over the past 7 decades, though we have witnessed wave after wave of Tibetans resisting China's rule, we have witnessed wave after wave of Tibetans resisting China's rule in myriad ways, despite the violence and excruciating suffering they surely know they will face as a result of their actions. Even when the stakes are highest and the repression is most severe, like in the lead up to the 2008 Olympic Games. And this is the beautiful truth that is the paradox of repression. The more the authorities try to suppress and control people through intimidation, coercion, and violence, the more the people will resist, and the stronger the desire for freedom will grow. We have seen this to be true time and time again in Tibet. Even today, in spite of the wave of violence and repression brought to Tibet since just the 2008 uprising alone, Tibetans continue to resist and to challenge Chinese rule, whether promoting traditional livelihoods, defending language and land rights, or working to stop destructive resource extraction projects. Tibetans are carving out space wherever they can to advance their struggle for rights and freedom through creative and organized nonviolent action. And as much as Tibet has been a laboratory for resistance, for repression all of these years, it has also been a laboratory for resistance, one where Tibetans are constantly testing out new strategies and tactics of defiance and resistance. And seeking answers to hold China accountable, I think the international community should take their lead from Tibetans. It's time for our governments, and indeed all of us, to do what Tibetans in Tibet have done all these years, and stand up to the Chinese government using creative new strategies and new tactics, and certainly then change will come.
Thank you, Lhadon. And I thought it was great as a fellow campaigner to finish talking about resistance, which those of us in the movement are well aware takes place by Tibetans inside Tibet and around the world. And we also know that Tibet can count on many friends, and we're going to hear from one of them now. Tim Loughton is the MP for East Worthing and Shoreham and the chair of the All-Party Parliamentary Group for Tibet, which is a group that raises Tibet in the UK. And Tim is going to talk a little bit about international support for Tibet.
John, thank you very much. And can I thank the Open Forum for inviting me to be on this panel today, a very eminent panel. I'm just a jobbing politician who's developed a close interest in Tibet and the long-term abuse of the Tibetans at the hands of the Chinese. So I thought I would bring things a little more up to date and hopefully have a few more grounds for some optimism after the very depressing but awful to familiar accounts we've heard from the video and from the previous speaker. Now, I'm getting quite a few invitations to speak on Chinese matters now, since I was one of 5 British Conservative MPs to be sanctioned by China just a few weeks ago, together with 2 members of the House of Lords in Britain, an academic and a human rights lawyer. And I have to say, being sanctioned by the Chinese Communist Party is a badge of honor. And it's also been a huge recruiting sergeant for people standing up and saying, hold on, is this really happening in China, and what can we do about it? So it's been a massive own goal by the Chinese Communist Party. And since it happened, the number of times the human rights abuses by the Chinese have been mentioned in Parliament, and not just in the British Parliament, but in parliaments around the world, because there were other parliamentarians from other countries who were sanctioned as well, have risen considerably, and Chinese human rights abuses are very much on the international radar. So we welcome what China has managed to achieve and shot itself in the foot. When we were sanctioned, we immediately had the solidarity and support of the British Prime Minister Boris Johnson and the American President Biden and many others as well. And I think what is now happening is a greater international cooperation between parliamentarians, democracies, and parliaments to work together to call out what has been going on in China for far too long. Something called IPAC, the Interparliamentary Alliance on China, has been formed with members of parliament from the States, from many European countries, from the UK Parliament, from Australia and beyond, working together, many of us sanctioned MPs, to shine a light on the abuses of China, to persuade our governments to be highly suspicious and cautious in their dealings with China. Yesterday, we had the very welcome announcement from the European Parliament that they're suspending negotiations on the China Comprehensive Agreement on Investment, at least until the 5 MEPs who have been sanctioned have those sanctions removed as well. So China, who's been used to getting its own way, through its bullying tactics, through its financial dominance in so many parts of the world, is at last finding some resistance, I'm glad to say. We recently had debates on a trade bill in the United Kingdom Parliament about our trading structures in the future, and we were able to put some conditions in there about dealing with nations who have committed genocide. And so China has been called out for the genocide that it has committed, undoubtedly now, against the Uyghur people. That definition of genocide was confirmed both by the previous American administration and most recently by the new Biden administration as well. We've seen very real sanctions now imposed on both sides of the Atlantic. We've had the Tibet Reciprocal Access Bill, which went through with support from all sides in the US Congress, and I'm actually presenting a similar bill to try and get the UK government to sign up to those same conditions against Chinese government and Chinese officials as well. The American government has imposed restrictions on import of cotton from Xinjiang province, where there's a suspicion it's been produced by slave labor. The British government also announced conditions on British businesses dealing in Xinjiang province as well. And of course, we've had the whole issue around oppression now in Hong Kong, and many Hong Kong citizens coming to the UK and being welcomed as British overseas passport holders. And we've also had, there's a very big piece in the Sunday Times, the London Sunday Times this week, which put the spotlight on the extent of Chinese investment within the United Kingdom, investment in power stations, in utility companies, even in schools that they've been buying up, in breweries, and a vast panoply of areas where the tentacles of the Chinese Communist Party, because it all leads back to them, have really enveloped so many parts of society in the UK. And it's the same for other countries as well. And I've been particularly keen to call out the influence of the Confucius Institutes, a highly sinister organization, which has been buying influence on university campuses and increasingly in schools as well, and is another propaganda arm of the Chinese government. And I'm really pleased to see that recently the telecoms regulator, Ofcom in the UK, closed down the CGTV broadcaster and raised the spotlight on the ultimate ownership of many of these Chinese companies, all linking back to the Chinese government. So this is beginning to have an effect on China. Practical measures on sanctions, at last standing up to call out some of these abuses and some of the very sinister influence that China is now imposing around the world. Now, I have been a supporter of the people of Tibet and a campaigner for many, many decades. Often I felt like a lone voice, certainly in the United Kingdom Parliament, but certainly in the last year or so, with the much higher publicity over what's been going on in Xinjiang province, now in Hong Kong, and the oppression of indigenous Mongolians as well, lots more people, I'm glad to say, have come to join the campaign. But of course, everything we've heard about recently about the oppression in Xinjiang, the forced sterilization, the labor camps, the genocide that's going on there, this is old hat for Tibetans. This has been going on for the last 62 years in Tibet since the occupation in 1959. The cause of over 1 million lives lost around the world. The tens of thousands of nuns and monks have been evicted from hundreds of destroyed monasteries. As we've heard from Lhadon, the undermining of those pillars of religion, and language and nomadic way of life. The 2.8 million rural Tibetans who've been transferred from nomadic farming and their goat herds destroyed as well, to concrete block encampments in semi-urban areas with no sustainable means to provide for themselves and their families, the equivalent of the Uyghur re-education camps as well. And also, it has to be said, the intimidation of Tibetans and Uyghurs, the diaspora around the whole world. It's not just within the borders of Tibet as well. And of course, a lot of this has happened under the watchful eye of Chen Guangzhou, who used Tibet as his training ground for what's now being imposed on the Uyghur people in Xinjiang province in the name of ethnic stability, a new cradle-to-grave system of displacement control and cultural erasure, which has emerged in Tibet and now in Xinjiang. And of course, in January 2020, a new law was passed by the Tibetan People's Congress under the control of China, of course, regulations on the establishment of a model area for ethnic unity and progress in the Tibetan Autonomous Region. This is all part of the Sinoization program. Despite a constitution of China that recognizes the autonomy and the cultural independence of people like the Tibetans. And they've done it in the name of eradicating poverty as well. We're told that they're lifting 10 million people out of poverty each year. But the Chinese definition of extreme rural poverty is just 4,000 yuan, or about 440 pounds sterling a year. That is just a pretense for what is a complete suppression of individual cultures and a whole re-education campaign that is going on through the very sinister means that Lhadon detailed as well. So, coming finally to the title of this this webinar is Free Tibet A Far Cry. How does all of this contribute to that? Well, the trouble is that China has a stranglehold in the United Nations. The United Nations has been completely limp at calling out these abuses. The control that they have of many client states in East Africa, where they've pillaged the resources of those countries and stuffed the leaders with the mouths with gold, with lots of loans and grants. The influence that China has in the World Health Organization, which is the big cover-up going on what's happened on the pandemic. And of course, it's impossible to bring China into the international courts and to show them up there. But it is a huge irony, because under the original Chinese constitution, it recognizes the law of regional national autonomy. The whole Chinese Soviet Republic was set up under the constitution, where basically the Chinese Soviet Republic acknowledges the right to national self-determination of minority nationalities within China's borders. But of course, it doesn't. The 5 original nationalities of China, the Han, the Man, the Mongolian, the Hui, and the Tibetans, mean nothing. By 1986, they had become 56 different nationalities, and yet everything that China has been doing has been to suppress those individual identities into one nation state that does not tolerate difference and individuality. So how important is the Tibetan Autonomous Region to China? Given that it's been called out of what's going on in Xinjiang, will it sacrifice the oppression in Tibet to relax its control there? I don't think anything is going to happen until His Holiness the Dalai Lama has passed away. That's going to be a very important moment, and long may that be in the future. But what has the Chinese government to fear from Tibet, the most peace-loving nation of people you would ever imagine, who pose no threat to the Communist Party or the nation of China? It's just an extraordinary thing that the mentality of the Chinese Communist Party is to suppress difference in individual cultures. And the very final thing I want to mention, which is where I think the world can and must call out what's going on in China, even if people have little interest in human rights, but the environmental vandalism that is going on within China, and particularly in the Tibetan plateau. The Tibetan Autonomous Region, the Tibetan Plateau, is always referred to as the third pole. It's the world's largest mass of frozen fresh water outside of the Arctic and the Antarctic. It provides drinking water for 225 million people and supplements the water supply of 1.9 billion and irrigates farms who feed many, many more. And those glaciers and that ice cap is melting. It's being polluted. The industrial activity in that whole area is adding to the Chinese pollution, which is responsible for 26% of the world's greenhouse gases, and that's getting worse. So I think China is now on the international community's radar for human rights, for environmental vandalism. And I think its reaction, its badly judged reaction to being called out recently, will only lead to more people, parliamentarians, ordinary people, environmentalists, but those interested in human rights around the world, whether you've heard of Tibet or Xinjiang province or the Uyghurs at all. I think the world has been woken up that what is going on within China's borders and increasingly beyond China's borders is unacceptable in this day and age, has to be called out and will be called out. And I'm glad for platforms like this, where we can try and recruit even more people to make sure that China is held to account, because it's got away with this for far too long. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Tim, for that thorough and really, in many places, optimistic talk. I think that's a great place for us to move into hearing from some of our viewers. Thank you for the questions you've been sending. We're going to start with a video question, and that's from Neha from the city of Kolkata in India.
On what historical basis does China claim its authority on Tibet?
So, on what does China claim authority on Tibet? Would someone on our panel like to handle this one?
I can speak to that, and maybe others can also pitch in. So, if you look at Chinese government documents and statements, and also books coming out of China or Tibet, justifying Chinese rule over Tibet, they would, they don't have a fixed date. Most often, they would go back to the period when both Tibet and China came under the Mongol rule, right? So we are talking about 12th and 13th century, right? But then some Chinese officials also go back to the period when actually Tibet and China were peer competitors as empires, and they would talk about the marriage between the Tibetan emperor and the Chinese princess as sort of justifications. And then they would also go back to the period when the Chinese would claim that the Ming Empire, followed by the Ching Empire, they all exercised sovereignty over Tibet. But the fact of the matter is that apart from the Yuan, which was Mongol, and the Qing, which was Manchu, the two Han Chinese dynasties, the Song and the Ming, did not have much substantial contact and relationship with Tibet proper, right? They had some sort of tribute relationship with Tibetan principalities at the very frontiers. So that's the sort of justification that these China-based empires exercised sovereignty over Tibet, and which is why the PRC felt justified to, in their language, liberate Tibet. But as I pointed out, these were Mongol empires, of which Russia, some parts of even Europe, and many other countries in East Asia were also part of that empire. It's not the same thing as saying that Tibet was part of a Chinese state.
Thank you, Tsering. Did anyone else on the panel have anything to add to that answer?
Perhaps I can just add, to an extent, it's academic. There are, every time you look at the history, and Dr. Topgyal is a much bigger expert than me, Tibet was never part of the state of China. And Tibet, right up until pre the Second World War, was recognized by the British Empire when Britain was in India as an independent state, and there's evidence of visas and passports and currency and everything else. But that's really not the point. The point is actually many Tibetans nice though it would be, but ultimately are not asking for full independence. The Dalai Lama has not said we must be part of an independent nation. But what Tibetans want is autonomy, which it is supposed to have under the existing Chinese constitution. If China actually followed its own rules and allowed Tibet to be able to follow its own culture and religion and language and education, all of those things that have been taken for granted in the past, then we not have this problem. So it's not a question of ownership by China. It's a question of if Tibet is going to be part of the nation of China in the future, then Tibet must have the basic freedoms that anyone else in the world takes for granted, and the Chinese constitution supposedly guarantees them in theory, but in practice clearly doesn't.
Lhadon.
Yeah, I think, it's important too to understand that the People's Republic of China illegally occupies Tibet under international law. And that, this is a really important point, I think, today for governments, especially those that are supportive of the Tibetan struggle and support the Dalai Lama's middle way approach, that the Chinese government is not the legitimate ruler. The People's Republic of China does not have sovereignty over Tibet, and this fact can't be lost as governments advocate for the middle way approach, or this, seeking genuine autonomy as a part of the People's Republic of China, whatever one might think about that as a practical solution at this point. I think when what we have now is China has so successfully challenged every government to say, to be afraid to even say anything about Tibet, that governments preemptively and gratuitously say, we recognize Tibet as a part of China, and we want the People's Republic of China, Chinese leaders to talk with the Dalai Lama, to dialogue with the representatives of the Dalai Lama. Well, unfortunately, what is happening in that moment, all China wants is, the Chinese government wants is legitimacy for its rule over Tibet. And when our governments say that we recognize Tibet as a part of China, and whatever comes next doesn't matter. The Chinese government have their legitimacy. They don't actually have legitimacy in Tibet with the Tibetan people. They know that. The world has seen that time and time again. And so they need governments and others to proclaim their legitimacy in Tibet. And every time our governments do that, it undermines the dialogue process. It undermines any chance. It undermines the Tibetan side and the Tibetan claim, because the truth is Tibet was an independent nation, or is at least, as of today, under international law, an occupied country. And so, there is, I think, a new push for what some are calling a course correction on Tibet, that governments who support even just the middle way approach as an genuine autonomy for Tibet within the People's Republic of China, support that as a viable solution for the future, then those governments should cease and halt the gratuitous use of this language that reinforces China's claim to Tibet, because really that's all they want. And once they get that, it's done. And there's no incentive. It disincentivizes the Chinese authorities to get to the table. And so, I would say in this moment when the world is, like-minded governments especially are reconsidering and starting to challenge the Chinese leadership and their, the bad behavior all across many, many issues in the world. I think it's key for governments at this point to also reconsider their approach to the Tibetan issue and these historical claims, and at least cease the use of this language that reinforces China's position.
Thank you. We're going to go to the next question.
When Tibet had de facto government between...
I'm very happy to play that one instead. Let's go ahead with the video question.
When Tibet had de facto government between 1913 and 1950, why did it not seek independent state status?
that comes off the tail of this previous question. I guess who would like to address this?
I'm happy to let others go first since I was the last time.
You're the
Go
expert.
Yes.
Yeah. So yeah, you're right that Central and Western Tibet, which sort of roughly corresponds to what is Tibet Autonomous Region today, was de facto independent. After the collapse of the Manchu Empire, and the main reason was obviously Tibetans were not sort of informed enough about international affairs. They were not informed by the Western notions of sovereignty, nation statehood, and all of that at that point. Although they were starting to open their horizons, but it has mostly to do with obviously the ineffectiveness of the government at that point, but also a great deal of manipulation and pressure by British India. Which obviously failed. British India wanted Tibet to remain autonomous enough to serve as a buffer and protection for British India from Russia or from the Chinese side, but they did not want Tibet to become independent enough to threaten the Indian Himalayas, which are Tibetan by ethnicity or by culture, language, and all of that. But also, they did not want Tibet to disrupt the economic, trade, and strategic dealings that British India wanted with China, right? And particularly as we draw to the Second World War, the British and the Allies wanted China on the side to fight the Japanese. So a great deal of Western, particularly British sort of manipulation was responsible for Tibet's failure. But it did try to sort of explore joining the League of Nations. There are communications between Tibetan officials and British sort of professors or officials who were responsible with the League of Nations and all of that, but they did not come to much because Tibetans were not skillful and adept enough at that point, but also a lot of pressure and manipulation from outside, from the Chinese as well as from the British and others.
Okay, thank you, Tsering. Did anyone else have anything to add? Otherwise, I can go to the next one. And this one is, why is China so keen of Tibet? And strategic reasons.
Yeah, I can start.
Please.
So nationalism, land, resources. I think obviously Tibet is part of the People's Republic of China's claim over so many lands and peoples that are not theirs around them. And then, of course, it's the strategic high ground. We've seen in recent times China pushing its claims on Tibet and through Tibet onto India, and actually even engaging in armed clashes and an attack on Tibetans, Indian army, including Tibetans in Ladakh or in the border region of India. And at the same time, the resources, I think the second largest, there's gold, there's copper. The second largest copper mine in China is in Tibet. And obviously there's a huge demand for copper right now. And so, between all of these things, the People's Republic of China wants to hold onto Tibet very tightly. And of course, the other great resource is water, and the controlling of water on the Tibetan plateau, the roof of the world, is is really an incredible strategic advantage for the Chinese government, whether that is to use the water resources, to divert those water resources for use of China, or just to hold the control. So many people downstream depending on their, the waters that originate in Tibet for their survival and their livelihood. So many nations dependent on those waters. For the Chinese government, that's an incredible advantage to have control over the source of all of those waters in Asia.
John, can I add? I think Lhadon is absolutely right on that. It is about control. It is about resources, and I think there's rare earth and uranium deposits of value there as well. But I mean, we see the control that it now has in Nepal as well, and particularly as a buffer to India. But it's also about face. I mean, China. The one thing China hates doing is losing face. Which is why I think it's now struggling with the criticism that it's getting in the international community, and why it's trying to bluff it out and is in denial. Originally, they could have made a case that there was is the Dalai Lama a threat, but clearly he's not. There's no threat that comes from Tibet towards the China regime, but the loss of face through losing Tibet as part of China, and why they don't want the world to see how Tibetans don't all love being part of the Chinese People's Republic, and why they're not waving flags willingly every time the Chinese government officials come to visit. That's why they don't want the world to see it. And the prospect of Tibet no longer being a full part of what they regard as a full part of China will be a huge loss of face in the international community for them. And that's something the Chinese fear virtually more than anything.
Yeah, to add, to build on Tim's comment about Tibet's relevance to China's face. So Tibet is important for the Chinese, and also explaining Chinese policies in Tibet, both domestically and internationally. Tibet, the mere existence of Tibetan as an issue, and existence of as a Tibetans as a separate identity group, right, disrupts China's legitimacy, China's image and face, but also China's ability to tell its own story, its narrative as a state. But particularly because China is growing and it wants to the superpower that is loved and respected, and by the rest of the world, the Tibetans disrupts China's ability to tell its own historical story, its own sense of self today. It disrupts China's ability to construct a national identity. Right, the Chinese have been trying to construct this overarching Chineseness, which includes everybody else. And Tibet's existence as a separate identity and entity disrupts all of that, which is why we see the more and more hardline policies today.
Yeah, it's one of the. Oh, sorry, I was just going to add. It's
please.
One of the questions that I think Tibetans get often is, "Gosh, there are so few Tibetans, and yet, the Chinese government is so hell bent on." And Tibetan monks and Buddhists, and they picture this just very peaceful, pacifist group that the Chinese government is so intent on controlling. But Tibetan resistance to Chinese rule has been so incredibly effective over all of these years, though of course the issue is not solved and Tibetans haven't been able to push China out of Tibet. But generation after generation, we are seeing, as I mentioned earlier, resist, push back, challenge in ways that are considering the absence of the use of violence overwhelmingly and peaceful methods. Tibetans have been so effective in undermining the Chinese narrative, the story of the People's Republic of China. And that's, of course, why the Chinese government goes to the international community and to other governments and corporations, and you name it, academics, to demand a recognition of their legitimacy in Tibet because they don't actually have it.
Well, it looks like the audience is super engaged. The questions are coming thick and fast. We're not going to get through all of them, I fear. But we've got a video question coming up. This is from Vicky in Dharamshala in India.
Why has the world and the UN not been very proactive about forced subjugation of Tibet by China?
Okay, we've had a few questions about the UN, including what the UN's position on China's occupation is. That's from Darren as well. Would anyone here like to speak about the UN side of things? Perhaps Tim, you look like you've got something to say.
Well, shall I just, I really, as I alluded to before, the UN has been completely and utterly toothless in getting anywhere with China, and the problem is so many countries are in the pay of China, and China has amassed a group of client states effectively within the UN who will do anything, as well as China itself on the Security Council, to block any measures against China itself. So this is what is frustrating, that the world's body that should be calling out this sort of thing is having no impact whatsoever, and China knows that, which is why individual nations are looking for alternative routes. And I mentioned IPAC and the increasing number of parliamentarians who are now coming together to put pressure on individual governments, as we've done, to try and put pressure on our government to call out the actions in Xinjiang as genocide, just as America has now done. A couple of European governments have now done, to be able to act individually, but in an international accord outside of the established international organizations such as the UN. And I think that's the way it's going. And if enough countries impose sanctions, impose restrictions, refuse to do trade deals, and actually scrutinize, as the Sunday Times has done, and does a proper audit of exactly what influence the Chinese government has bought in their educational establishments, in their businesses, in their infrastructure as well. We put the block on Huawei becoming a major player in the 5G telecoms contract in the UK, and China took that very badly. Now, if enough nations do that and carve China out of various business deals, then this is going to start to have an impact, because, as I say, the UN just isn't doing it.
Well, if I can give a bit more academic answer, if any of you go on to study international relations, which is what I teach with East Asian affairs, you will have debates about whether and to what extent international institutions and international law has causal force or independent causal force in international relations. And there is actually a theory in international relations which makes the case that international institutions and international law have a great deal of causal force in shaping and regulating behavior of states and how international relations happen. But a criticism of this theory says that international institutions, international law are byproducts of power politics, particularly politics among great powers. And what Tim just spoke about earlier, about China being a member of the United Nations Security Council and the veto power it has, it is just a very sort of strong illustration of the criticism that international institutions are byproducts and they are just tools that great powers use to pursue their own interests. It is just another platform where states pursue interests rather than being shaped themselves.
I would just add that I think the search for solutions as to how to move Chinese leaders to respond to do anything to mitigate their actions, and especially, of course, in East Turkestan, or with the Uyghur people in the concentration camps that are there, the genocide that is being carried out. But what we're seeing with Hong Kong, what we're seeing, in Tibet, and Southern Mongolians were recently protesting, of course, because they're devastated over these these changes that are now taking place to the education system and to the switch to Chinese medium education. So I think as the international community seeks answers and new ways to get the Chinese government to stop, I think the key is to do things that that really make them sit up and take notice, and where the leadership in Beijing can see the potential for these methods or these new tactics to mean something really big down the road. And so for Tibet, there's long been talk about pushing some kind of contact group, some kind of government where governments can collaborate, like-minded governments can collaborate, can work together to coordinate their strategies on how they approach the issue of Tibet, how they can help the Tibetan people. I think right now, if we want the Chinese leadership to sit up and take notice, then I think the new things have to be done. And the will is there, I believe, amongst decision makers and governments to do something in a way like we haven't seen in the past 2 decades, for sure. And we are, a whole coalition of frontline communities, Tibetans, Uyghurs, Hong Kongers, Chinese rights activists, and our supporters. We're pushing for, certainly there's been a push for a diplomatic boycott of the Olympic Games. There are many of us now who are just, after years really of trying to engage with the International Olympic Committee, are now calling for an all-out boycott of the Olympic Games. Whether or not that will happen in the end, the point is that it's the right thing to do, that genocide has to be a red line. There has to be a place. Even the International Olympic Committee won't go to host the Olympic Games. And when genocide is actively being carried out by the host nation, then perhaps that is the clear sign, and or if there's an argument, because some people say it's not genocide, if there's an argument about whether something is genocide or crimes against humanity, that should be the signal that that the Olympic Games cannot be held in such a place. And I think that is something the Chinese government would sit up and take notice of, that, a coordinating push, even by a handful of governments, to really talk about this, to push this to, this, if not now, when, with the attack and the assault and the undermining of democracy and all the brave democracy proponents in Hong Kong, with what's happening in Tibet, with what we know is happening in East Turkestan to millions of people. This has to be the moment. And we have to be calling for it. Tibetans, supporters, human rights activists. There is no way, I just cannot imagine how anyone, a person of conscience in this age of Black Lives Matter and, this new sort of, I feel like, political activism that really is powerful in the world today, how can people even consider going to the Olympic Games or sending people to the Olympic Games? I know it's that question of the athletes absolutely breaks my heart, and their lifelong commitment to sport and their incredible achievements. But we have to think about this in the terms of the cost of the impact on China, and what does it say to Beijing if, while they're carrying out what the world is now recognizing it as genocide, if we hold an Olympic Games and we give them the stamp of approval that they are really looking for. We know that's what authoritarian governments and leaders want with something like the Olympic Games. 2008 already happened. The Olympics already happened. There was already an uprising and a crackdown and a massive escalation of repression in Tibet. Look where China has gone since then. Where do they go? Where does Beijing go after this, if the Olympic Games are allowed to be held without real opposition?
Thank you, everyone. I think we've got time for one last question. I see there's absolutely tons of them that have come through, a lot of them to do with history. And I do suggest that the conversation doesn't stop here. We've all got our websites, our organizations, and other resources that you can follow up on. There's so much to learn about Tibet, but I just wanted to ask something, because we've spoken a lot about Tibetan resistance and agency, and I think a good note to finish on is, what kind of society do we think Tibetans would build if Tibet were free? And I know there are some clues out there, but perhaps Tsering or Lhadon would like to jump in first on this one, and then we get everyone's thoughts.
Yeah, can I first just very quickly respond to a question from Tashi Pinzo in the comment section, which is directed towards me, and he has repeated it a few times. Very quickly, there are two questions. One is, did Central Tibet become part of the Ching Empire? The answer is, simply yes. As I said, Central and Western Tibet was ruled differently from, Eastern Tibet, which is why in the similar agreement, for example, we had this notion of outer Tibet and inner Tibet. We don't have the time to get into the details, but the influence and the strength of Manchu power in Tibet was strong at some points, but waned over time. The second question was, the 17-point agreement of 1951 a lawful agreement? So this is quite a difficult and conversation to have among Tibetans. If we take a moral sort of stance, then obviously we would say that it was not a lawful agreement because it was forced by the Chinese on weaker Tibetans and all of that. But if we take a sort of hard-nosed legalistic point of view, then I would say that because irrespective of the thing about whether the Tibetan seal which was put on the agreement was genuine or not, or the Chinese manufactured it and all of that. But eventually, the Tibetan government, with the Dalai Lama's name, agreed to the agreement. So I would say that it was lawful, and lawful to the extent the other two treaties that China was forced to sign with the British, with the French, with the British, and the Japanese were lawful. And I would say it was lawful until it was refuted by the Tibetan government, after the 1959, uprising, right? So, I will end there and maybe let Lhadon to comment on the question here.
So I do think, without dwelling on it, I would say the arguments for the why that was not a lawful agreement and why China's occupation of Tibet today is illegal under international law. All of it is outlined in this new Tibet Brief 2020, which I recommend people read. The arguments are very clear, the historical arguments, the international legal arguments. And I think the idea that it's time for a course correction on Tibet, all of it is in here with very clear recommendations for policy makers. And I think that's, yeah, I'll leave it there. So please. And the question about what kind of society would Tibetans build if it was free? I think for me, the question really is, as a Tibetan living in exile, born in Canada, my father was born in Tibet and left Tibet as a young person, and has never been able to go back and see his family. I feel like it's my job to work for Tibetans inside Tibet first and foremost, and that whatever Tibetans inside Tibet want in the end, that is the key to me. And what society they want to build and how. I believe, of course, that all of the most beautiful and progressive values and vision for a future free Tibet, are possible. But I just think for me, the key is the people inside and what they want. It's, you know, I don't live there. I am not subject to the Chinese government's daily repression and policies. And though I cannot wait for the day that I can return and visit and see the land of my ancestors, it's about what Tibetans inside Tibet want. And I think very clearly they have said, a new generation has said time and time again, and especially these last 10 years, that they want freedom, that they want the return of the Dalai Lama, that they want independence, that they want to be in charge of their own lives and free to do with their lives whatever they want. And that's the key to me in the work that I do as a Tibetan who lives in freedom and peace.
Shall I just? I mean, I can't really add to that, and of course, it must be up to the people of Tibet, inside Tibet, and those who've been forced to live their lives elsewhere in the world, to decide what sort of society they should have. One thing they could teach the Chinese is the power of democracy there. I mean, in its own limited way, the Tibetan government in exile, and the way that representatives from around the world, from Canada, from Switzerland, from the UK, or whatever, are elected by the Tibetan diaspora and come together in Dharamsala for those sittings. And I've been privileged to go and visit there. And the role of the Sikyong, who I think has the retiring Sikyong, who's done a fantastic job, is a great example of the power of democracy, even when you are under such constraints about being able to select the people who are speaking for you in government. Absolutely stands out. So I'm sure that if one day, hopefully, Tibetans have their power of destiny to restored to them as to how they live their lives within Tibet, it will be one that respects the power of democracy and electing their own people to run their own lives. And the examples of the Dalai Lama on religious tolerance, on the nurturing the environment and everything else, Tibetans have an awful lot to teach the rest of the world, starting with China itself.
Do you have time for
Absolutely.
me to say anything? I'm happy to, not say anything.
No, please do. You can have the last word, Tsering.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, I won't say a lot. Essentially, we have to, not pretend that it would be an easy experience. If we had a Tibet for ourselves, it is one thing to create a state, but another thing to run a state. As we are experiencing even in the small exile community, there's a lot of debate and disagreements and all of that. So, but it would have to be something that the majority of the Tibetans who live inside Tibet will want, right? But if you look at the Tibetan society inside Tibet, to the extent Chinese allow debate and discussion, there are debates between secular, sort of modern educated intellectuals and the sort of monastic religious, scholars about the role of religion in Tibetan society. So, the Tibetans will have a lot of debate and bargaining and navigation for what type of state and society they would want. So it would definitely not be the Tibet of the past. It would definitely not be the Tibet that we have under Chinese rule today, but it would at least be a Tibet that would be ruled by Tibetans according to Tibetan ideals, values, through Tibetan language. So it would be, a very different Tibet from the past as well as what it is today.
Thank you, Tsering, and thank you to all of our panel. That's all we've got time for today. Really sorry for those of you who didn't get your question asked, but thanks to those that watched and contributed, and thanks especially to our panel, Dr. Tsering, Topgyal, Lhadon, Tethong, and Tim Loughton, as well as the Open Society for organising this. Goodbye.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.